I'm Jamil Jaffer. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute here at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. We are thrilled today to have a real American hero with us, General David Petraeus. General Petraeus served in a variety of roles through his government over the course of a nearly four decade career in the government and the U.S. military, completing his service as director of CIA. Today, General Petraeus is a partner and the chairman of the KKR Global Institute. Prior to joining KKR, General Petraeus served for 37 years in the military. He had 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat. He was the commander of the surge in Iraq, commander of U.S. Central Command, and the commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following his retirement from the military and being confirmed by the U.S. Senate, General Petraeus served as the director of the CIA. He was instrumental in key victories in the global war on terror, led the agency's digital initiatives, and made significant investments in the most important part of the CIA, its human capital. General Petraeus has, of course, earned numerous awards, medals, decorations. He's been decorated by 13 foreign countries, including 4 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, the Bronze Star for Valor, 2 NATO Meritorious Service Medals, the Combat Action Badge, the Ranger Tab, Master Parachutist, and Air Assault badges. So we're thrilled, General Petraeus, to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us, and we're excited about the conversation.
Great to be with you, Jamil, and thanks for what you did back in the day when we were serving in government together.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. So, General Petraeus, and by the way, for the audience, we're going to have a conversation between me and General Petraeus for about 30, 35, 40 minutes, but there'll be time for your questions. So, to the extent you have questions that come up along the way, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at about the 35, 40-minute mark. So, General, you served as the commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan. We've had big news about U.S. forces in Afghanistan here in the last month or two, with President Biden making the determination that we will move away from the conditions-based approach, and we will withdraw in full by no later than September 11th, 2021. You've recently argued that we're likely to look back on this decision and potentially regret it. And rather than terminating endless wars, which is what President Obama called for, President Trump called for, President Biden has called for, there's a potential for us to end up back in this conflict in the future. Talk to us about sort of your thinking here and what the administration might do, if anything, to ameliorate some of the concerns that you have.
Well, first of all, no one wants to end endless wars more than those who have actually been part of them and know the loss and serious injury and wounds and destruction and so forth that accompany wars. And I'd love to see this war ended in the way that actually most of the candidates said they would, which was, quote, responsibly. Right. And I fear that this is a decision that we will look back on and regret. It is already clear, in fact, that the security situation is eroding quite rapidly. There's a psychological component to this that is very, very important. Afghan security forces, like any soldiers anywhere in the world, will generally continue to fight as long as they think that there's someone coming to the rescue, a quick reaction force, and that there will be supporting fires, close air support being the most important of those, of course, in Afghanistan, a very vast country with mountainous terrain and a limited road infrastructure. And that which does exist is cut in many areas now already by the Taliban. So you've got to have air support. You have to have tactical air mobility, the C-130 aircraft that we have provided to them, and then the dozens of Black Hawk helicopters. And we've also provided fixed wing close air support aircraft and Little Bird attack aircraft. I fear that maintaining those aircraft is going to prove very, very difficult. It already is. It is being flown at an operational tempo that is vastly higher than even what we flew in the busiest, most demanding months of the surge in Iraq or the surge in Afghanistan. And they don't have the extraordinary resources, contractors, maintenance personnel trained and with the whole logistical structure and system to provide the parts, the tools, the sets, kit outfits, as the terminology goes, and so forth. There will be battle losses. Now, there was a promise of several dozen additional Black Hawk helicopters, some additional fixed wing aircraft, and so forth, some additional money, keeping some of the contractors there for a period of time. But I fear that once the Afghan forces realize that there is nobody coming to the rescue, there's going to be no air medical evacuation, no air resupply, no close air support, that they will begin to either surrender, desert, or not fight very hard. We've seen some of that already. And indeed, the Afghan Air Force is already stretched very, very thin. And the assets that we used to provide to enable our Afghan partners in the fight against the Taliban, and also, of course, other groups, including two extremist elements, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State Khorasan group, which is an element of the Islamic State operating in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Those clearly have been going away. It's not clear whether we will help them if there are major cities that are under siege while we're still there, but again, you can see where this is headed, and tragically, it appears to be headed toward a civil war similar to that which followed the collapse of the post-Soviet government of Najibullah, who ended up, of course, swinging in a noose from a telephone pole in Kabul, as all of these different fighting forces, militias, were fighting to gain control of Kabul. The Taliban won out, of course, a very harsh, very almost medieval kind of religious, ultra conservative, extremist in some respects, turning soccer fields into really killing fields. And obviously the lot and life of women under those regimes is terrible. You saw millions of refugees flooding into Pakistan in particular. And I fear that we're going to see an awful lot of that again. The militias actually are already mobilizing. There are local forces that are being allowed to form because the government has few alternatives. Any of the names that we know from decades ago are going to resurface. And you'll see the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and Hazara probably have to protect themselves, the Shia, as well as different Pashto groups, and including, obviously, again, the principal insurgent elements, the Haqqani and their affiliate, the Taliban and the Haqqani network. So again, it just does not look to me that there are going to be any happy endings here whatsoever. And at some point in time, Al-Qaeda and perhaps the Islamic State will be able to reestablish the kind of sanctuary in Afghanistan in which Al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks and conducted the initial training of the attackers. Now, I don't want to overstate that, because I don't see for the near term, unless there is some dramatic increase in their capability in the so-called cyber caliphate world. And so, in other words, using the internet, social media, and various skills there, by which they might be able to amplify their effect much more substantially than what they'll be able to do physically from a remote base in eastern Afghanistan. But noting again, it was in that remote base in eastern Afghanistan where the 9/11 attacks were planned. I don't see them having that capability. I also believe that we very likely would be able to detect something much more effectively than we were prior to 9/11. You know, all the changes that have been made to to our intelligence architecture, the organizational architecture, the capabilities, the assets we have now, and all the rest of that. But that said, we obviously are having to shrink our intelligence footprint. If you don't have all those bases out there as lily pads, or at least as locations that can provide quick reaction forces and medical evacuation, we don't put our people out there without those kinds of assets. And yet that is what is going to happen to the Afghan forces. But so we'll do an awful lot of this. There will be some certainly capabilities resident in the embassy in Kabul. But again, it's going to be considerably reduced. And if you recall what happened when we pulled out of Iraq, and the blame for what happened after we did that does not fall on the Obama administration. They owned the decision, but the blame is the prime minister, who, as you'll recall, undid all that we had worked so hard during the surge and the subsequent 3.5 years to bring a fabric of society back together that had been torn apart by the very near full-on civil war between Sunni and Shia Arabs. And that came back together, was going well, and it was his impulsive and highly sectarian actions right after our forces left. In fact, General Austin, now Secretary of Defense Austin, was the final person out. And within 24 hours, Prime Minister embarked on these very, very highly sectarian actions that literally just tore the society apart. By the way, just as an aside, I showed up a couple of days later as the director of the CIA to see the members of the CIA station there before Christmas, only to find that, I mean, it was just as if I'd arrived pre-surge. What I recall, the days of that where everyone was at everyone else's throat, and literally spent the first night I was there just shuttling back and forth, trying to keep people from shooting at each other. Literally, there was an M1 tank cannon with its tube pointed at the home where the Sunni Arabs were all gathered together, trying to figure out what they were going to do in response to the prime minister preferring charges against the senior Sunni official in the entire government, the vice president, and also the security detail. So, but what also happened is that because we did not have a presence, we were slow in seeing what the Islamic State was doing. They got back, they reconstituted, got off their stomachs, went into Syria, gathered considerable additional power. And then when it was very clear that they were threatening, a humanitarian crisis, what they were doing to the Yazidis, threatening the Kurdish regional government capital, then threatening the very outskirts of Baghdad, it was very difficult to get back in there. And that's a place that has much more advantageous location than does Afghanistan, where we have bases in countries all around it, big bases in Kuwait, all up and down the Gulf, Jordan, Turkey, and so forth. And it's not landlocked. We can get right into it. We have huge challenges with Afghanistan if we're going to operate, quote, offshore. Even if we get a base in the one country that might allow that, which is still probably unlikely, and that would be to put a base back into the Karshi-Khanabad air base
K2,
in the invasion of Afghanistan in Uzbekistan. That's a long way still. You have to go over the Hindu Kush to get to where the majority of the fighting, even to Kabul, and the majority of the fighting. Beyond that, if you're operating from Qatar or the Emirate bases, the UAE bases that we have, that's a really long distance. And of course, we can't take the most direct route. We have to go out and around because Iran is maybe there's a base in some other country. It's a little bit closer, Oman, perhaps, something like that. But again, it's still a very long distance. And with our drones, this is just a problem we've never really had to this degree. And we don't have refuelable drones, at least not in large numbers. So that's a real challenge that is going to exist. And of course, there are 18,000 battlefield interpreters that the president has said we will not leave them behind. But I don't know how you don't leave them behind unless we're going to mount a huge airlift in the next couple of months, because the clock is very much ticking. And then put them in a third country, who knows, again, perhaps one of the Gulf states. And then sort out their status there and do the checks that we have been trying to do in Afghanistan, but which have literally stopped because the interview process stopped due to a serious COVID spread within the embassy workforce. So again, there are a lot of real challenges here. And, as I mentioned, right after that decision was announced, I fear we're going to regret this. I'm also sensing right now that we really haven't had the kind of detailed planning to execute what it is that we're doing, because we don't know of the possibility of a base in a neighboring country. Again, it's down to just one anyway, and that might not be all that ideal, and it might be limited as to whether or not armed aircraft could operate from it. So we're really doing some of this as we're going along. Certainly, that's the case with those who qualify for the special immigrant visa. And again, that's some 18,000 or so by the last State Department count. Individuals who served on the ground with our men and women in uniform for 2 years. That's what they have to do to qualify for it. Shared risk and hardship. Our son was a second lieutenant rifle platoon leader when I was the commander. And those battlefield interpreters were not just, taking words from one language into another. They were their cultural advisors. They were their eyes and ears. They were really, really valuable. And again, had the equivalent of multiple Army tours. So these are full year tours. And that is a long time. And we owe that. We have a real moral obligation to them. By the way, their families are also in jeopardy because of what generally their husbands or fathers did serving alongside our forces.
Right. And everyone knows. I mean, there is no question that we cannot leave those people out to dry. It would be a complete moral failure on our part if we were to do that.
It would. And the president has basically acknowledged that by saying we will not leave them behind. That is a policy decision when the president says something like that. It almost harkens back to President George H.W. Bush, who said, this will not stand when told about the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And, I was actually the aide to the chief of staff of the Army at the time. And I remember there were lots of debates initially until they went over to the White House. Right. And the president, he just cut through it. This will not stand.
Right.
And everybody said, okay, got it. That's pretty straightforward. Now we know what our mission is. This is not going to stand. How do we get them out? How do we re-liberate this country? He said they will not be left behind. Okay, now let's see what the details of the plan are. How are we going to operationalize his policy decision? But again, I do fear for the Afghans. I did the dinner with President Ashraf Ghani and Chairman Abdullah and the other members, all of whom are old, have been in the Afghan government almost continuously since 2002. And this is a very, very tough situation for them. Now, they made it easy at all times, not necessarily. There's been, absolutely an internecine political maneuvering and wrangling and fighting and corruption and, all kinds of challenges. And again, it's very easy to get frustrated with that. But at the end of the day, again, I think that this is something that we didn't have to do. We could have very easily just kept 3,500 troops there. I've often described that what you need in these kinds of situations, and we should have had in Iraq as well, is a sustainable commitment. Sustainability is measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure. And if you can do that with 3,500 troops, which, by the way, also meant that you had 8,000 additional coalition forces because they're coming out now as well.
Yes.
And 18,000 or so contractors who, again, among whose tasks are keeping the Afghan fixed wing, rotary wing aircraft operating, and also the weapon systems, the vehicles, more sensitive stuff, night vision goggles, et cetera, et cetera. So again, by pulling that out, for the lack of 3,500 troops, we may have consigned a country to a civil war. I do think this has some repercussions elsewhere. I know that they are saying that we don't worry. This doesn't mean that we wouldn't do something, say in the Indo-Pacific, if that is necessary, or in this other place. Don't mistake this for a lack of resolve or what have you. I don't know how you can't look at this and at least call that into question.
Right.
I mean, and that is a superpower has to keep a lot of plates spinning, to use the metaphorical image of the guy in the circus that puts a plate up, gets it spinning, goes over, does it with another, gives this one, and just keeps him. Sooner or later, he's got 10 or 15 plates spinning. And certainly one of those, in our case, is vastly bigger than all of the others put together. That's the one that represents the US-China relationship, and really the US and all of our allies and partners' relationship with China. And we can talk more on that in a moment. Yeah. But superpowers also have to keep a lot of other plates spinning. And again, we're seeing that in Somalia, where we had a very small presence, doing that from outside, offshore, what have it, is not easy. The same with, when President Trump tried to pull the troops out of Syria, put them back in. But, these were just leave less than 2,000 troops there. And again, what's wrong with that? We've lost vastly more men and women in uniform in training accidents and collisions at sea than we have on the battlefield. So again, I would think that this is sustainable. Again, understanding absolutely the desire to end endless wars, but also believing that you need to try to end them responsibly and as well as you can, not just because, again, we're not ending the endless war. We're ending our involvement in it. The endless war is going to get worse.
Yeah. Well, so General, I mean, I think this is exactly right. But one of the challenges, obviously, domestically we have, is that I think there's a perception, certainly among our leaders. We've now seen 3 presidents in a row, Republicans and Democrats alike, Biden, Trump, Obama, all of whom said, we've got to end these endless wars. They all tried to pull out of Afghanistan completely. They all tried to pull out of Iraq, Syria completely. And now President Biden is committed to this effort, and it appears it's going to happen. But there are these claims, we talk about these ideas, we'll run these over the horizon operations, right? I think you've laid out exactly the reasons why that's a challenge and unlikely to be successful. Now that we are where we are, right? What impact, you alluded to it, but I want to be really direct about it, because we all saw what happened when President Obama set a red line in Syria. We didn't enforce it ultimately, and there are a million different reasons we can all argue about. It was Congress's fault, they didn't authorize it, the president didn't strike, whatever, right? We put aside the politics of it, right? It clearly sent a message, right? And we've seen the outcome of that. We've seen the Russians all over the region. We've seen the taking of Crimea. We've seen the building of bases in the South China Sea. A lot of that is an outgrowth of a perception by our adversaries that we're not committed to our red lines, that we won't take casualties, and this reinforces that narrative. Is that right? And if it is right, is there anything to do to ameliorate that problem, that perception amongst our adversaries, that you could just outweigh the Americans? They don't really have the stomach for the fight.
Well, I think it's a good bit more nuanced than that, candidly.
Yeah.
And again, I did say surely there will be at the very least some perceptions that derive from this, but certainly we are taking a whole host of steps in a lot of other ways. By the way, I should just point out to the audience, I am completely not just nonpartisan, I am non-political. I don't register. I will give advice to either members of either party and have and continue to do so, including the current administration and members of the party in opposition.
Right.
And again, it doesn't matter who's in office. There was a number of actions taken by the previous administration that struck me as very, very ill-advised, not the least
Absolutely.
of which was negotiating away with the Taliban whatever leverage we had, and the commitment to withdraw all our forces without the Taliban giving up virtually anything. In fact,
That's right.
Pressured the Afghan government to give back 3,000 or 4,000 of their, or perhaps more of their detainees, hundreds of whom have already been recaptured, showing that they didn't honor the commitment to lay down their arms and not return to the fight.
Yes.
We've gotten virtually nothing from the Taliban. I mean, well, maybe they didn't attack us for a period of time, but
a fairly short period of time, to be clear.
So again, what did we get out of these negotiations, from which we excluded the actual elected Afghan government? And I mean, there's a question there. If we really are bringing back our emphasis on democracy and human rights and women's rights and all the rest of that, what does this say about that? The Taliban are obviously not paragons of virtue when it comes to any one of those particular issues or the values and freedoms that we cherish and are once again seeking to promote around the world. But again, it is more nuanced than that. There's much more to it. And frankly, I agree with about 95% of what the new administration is doing in its effort when it comes to the foreign policy, establishing a sequencing process that it begins at home, that you have to first combat the pandemic. Needless to say, again, the foundation of strength for your foreign policy comes from your domestic economic, political, social situation. So you got to combat the pandemic. We've done that very, very impressively. A lot of work to be done. Certainly, we'd like to get further vaccination. But again, compared to the rest of the world, the U.S. is leading the way. Second, then make sure the economy is being brought back. I mean, we've done that so effectively that the worry is actually inflation and a worker shortage. There's a variety of reasons for that, needless to say, and hopefully the inflation concerns will prove to be transitory rather than longer running. But that's a serious debate. As a former economics professor, it's been fascinating to watch. Yeah. Then, of course, pursue the investment in our infrastructure, which in many cases is desperately in need of refurbishment, repair, reconstruction, new construction, promote the elements of the future, really, the sectors that are going to drive the economy in the future, a whole variety of tech, AI, machine learning, also green, the renewable energy production, all of these different initiatives, including investing in our people, and so forth. So that is all absolutely, in my mind, you can argue about some of the projects, you can argue about some of the numbers, the magnitude, right, whatever. But again, I think that is all very seriously needed. And in the meantime, you are engaging, or in some cases, re-engaging after a period that in many respects, especially the final 2 years, was an America First approach, not just rhetorically, but also in actions. And so you're re-engaging with our most important Asia allies and partners, including especially the Quad. And that is at levels it's never been before, helped in part because of what China has done to India. Then you have the G7 summit, very successful. You have the US-EU summit, equally successful, a NATO summit, some bilateral summits and meetings, the meeting with President Putin, and now they're ready to begin the most important summit and relationship of all, noting that obviously the US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor met with their counterparts in Alaska, right, in a pretty contentious, at least publicly. My understanding is when the doors closed, it got down to business. But now you can start to anticipate, perhaps on the margins of the G20 meeting in Italy in the coming months, a meeting between President Xi and President Biden. And again, all of this to establish a coherent, comprehensive whole of governments with an S on the end. So all of our elements of power, plus those of all of our partners and allies around the world, which we uniquely have in the policy for China to ensure that, cooperate where we can, climate, pandemic, some other issues, compete where that's necessary in a lot of sectors that will be, try to get it as level playing field as is possible. And obviously avoid true confrontation that actually, and I'm talking about physical confrontation, kinetic confrontation, that could arise from miscalculation, misperception, mistakes, what have you, by ensuring that we really shore up deterrence for that particular relationship, and keeping in mind that deterrence is a function of an adversary's perception of our capabilities and our will to employ those capabilities. And that's a long-winded way of getting back to how does each individual decision around the world affect the adversary's perceptions of your capabilities and most particularly your willingness to employ them.
So let's talk about that piece, right? How in your mind, does China view today our capabilities and will to push back on their activities, particularly in the region, right? Let's talk about the Quad, right? The South China Sea, right? Whether we're talking about Taiwan, whether we're talking about their behavior with respect to democracy in Hong Kong, their oppression domestically of the Uyghur Muslims. Does China perceive that we have the capability and the will to address any or some of those issues if they were to go further, right? If they were to cross the Taiwan Strait? And what impact, if any, do a lot of these things that are happening in other places? You point out we had a great meeting with the Europeans when it came to both NATO, the G7, and the like, and commitments came out of that, right? We'll see how that gets implemented. Do you see the Chinese perception changing of our capabilities and will, or where do you see that stands today?
Well, I think it's still, frankly, premature to even make that kind of assessment, given that this administration is still in its first 6 months.
Right.
And by the way, up front, I should note, I mean, my most fervent desire is that the U.S.-China relationship is one that is as absolutely mutually beneficial as is possible, because the alternative obviously could be very grim in a nuclear age. Graham Allison did the wonderful study of these, I think it was 16 cases in the last few centuries where you have an established power and a rising power. And he uses this, dates back to the Peloponnesian Wars, where, of course, Thucydides wrote about Sparta, the established power, read the United States, Athens, the rising power, read China. And he wrote in the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, inevitably they went to war. I mean, inevitably, you can't go to war in a nuclear age. You've got to avoid that. And you've got to be very, very careful in how it is that you do that. And in the big idea here, of course, is to be firm, but not needlessly provocative. But keep in mind that China's assessment of not just the US, but generally of the West, is that it is in terminal decline. And so from their perspective, and perhaps strengthened a bit by how impressively they did in responding to the pandemic. They certainly didn't lose 600,000 people. They didn't have again, millions and millions of cases. Now you can question the system and processes and I hold our freedoms and values and so forth very, very dear.
Right.
But again, from their perspective, that's what they have seen of the West. And they're keenly aware that contrary to what was written back in 1989 by Francis Fukuyama in that famous essay, The End of History, which then became a book, propelled the national interest membership so much. I was in an academic phase at that time and one of the only 10,000 subscribers, I think. But as you recall, his conclusion was, or his prediction was, that this competition of systems, which is how he described history, the dialectic and the competition between contending systems, in that competition, the US-led Western system of democratically elected governance and free market economics was prevailing and had prevailed really over the Soviet Communist Party and its command economy. And so history was over, he wrote. And the zenith of history, again, in the development of systems, was what it was that we have. Well, China now, certainly with considerable reason, can beg to differ. They have done in 42 years since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to China what no country in history has ever done in terms of economic growth, pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, building infrastructure that is the envy of much of the rest of the world, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, helped by having a market of 1.3 billion people. But there are other countries that have over 1 billion people that have not achieved that same kind of growth. And meantime, they look at the Western democracies and they see a degree of populism. I think it's fair to assess that we have had a bit of populism in our country in recent years, and not just in the previous administration. It started a while before that.
That's right.
And look at UK with Brexit, look at France, where Marine Le Pen won over 30% of the vote. Again, you just walk your way around the democracies. And from their perspective, at the least, you can say, hey, look, our system's better. Again, they're in terminal decline. We are going to prevail in whatever competition takes place. Now, I don't think that is going to be the case. I'm one who believes, as Warren Buffett has often said, that it never pays to bet against America. I certainly hope that's true, and I touch wood while I say that, and that many of the programs being pursued by the administration, in many cases with bipartisan support, certainly when it came to reviving the economy, combating the pandemic, even I hope we'll see with the infrastructure bill and so forth, that you're going to see a US with a lot of pent-up demand from the period of the pandemic, just accelerating growth. It's already started, and the growth is going to be very, very considerable. And as a partner in one of the world's biggest investment firms, one that owns 110 companies, I think we have a reasonable assessment of this, and then minority investments in another 100 or so. So that's my hope of what is going to happen, and that the Chinese assessment will be one that they're on a bit of a rebound. They have got allies and partners. It's noisy and it looks sort of ugly sometimes, and there's a cacophony associated with these democracies. But by golly, look at what they are doing. So very, very premature at this point, I think, to say that China might perceive what I have just described. Because it is still, it's very much show me time. You really have to have, my dad was a crusty Dutch sea captain who came to America at the beginning of World War II and sailed throughout the war in the US Merchant Marine. And he would look at me and say, results, boy. And I think, we're at that point, results, US, and that's what we need to pull together and produce those.
Yeah. Well,
in so doing.
Yeah, and look, I think that's the key is this is a point about leading the world. And I do want to get to audience questions here in just a minute, but I do want to ask you about a point that you made earlier. And you have this unique perspective, right? Because you've had a long history of national security and leading our troops in combat. But you've also had a long career as teaching economics and now leading as part of KKR this effort to acquire and develop both startups. I mean, you're an advisor to 20 startups, an investor in 20 startups, and large scale.
That's personal. That's separate. They're all approved by KKR, and many
Fair
of the partners invest in startups.
Fair enough. And obviously KKR's large 110 acquisitions that it owns, and the other 100 companies have minority investments in. So you have a unique perspective from an economic perspective and a national security perspective on this problem. And I guess what I'm interested to hear from you is in this scenario, we're coming out of the COVID pandemic. You made a strong case for the idea that we're going to accelerate, right? But a lot of that turns on some of the investments that we're making in infrastructures. A lot of it turns on us protecting this new sort of innovation economy that we're building here in this country. And we've seen, a lot of the intellectual property walk out the back door to China, right? A lot of what you described in Chinese growth and success hasn't been solely based on the theft of that intellectual property, but some of it has. How do we have an opportunity here to effectively win this economic competition, or even compete effectively, given the 1.3 billion consumers and sort of worker base in China? And if we do, what's the method to getting there? Is it purely America simply out innovating, out thinking, outperforming, out just sort of moving faster, or is there some other methodology we've got to adopt looking at this large scale generational threat?
Well, look, it's always all of the above.
Yeah.
And we have seen challenges in the past, never anything remotely on the scale and magnitude and frankly achievement of China. We had, when I was literally in graduate school, the United States was asking itself, why don't we have industrial policy? Japan's got industrial policy. Why don't we have a ministry of, what was it, industry and
MIDI, yes.
We had classical economists at Princeton that said, well, let's see how this works out. Again, we've had these cycles before. Our auto industry isn't as competitive as it was, and Japan is outdoing us in that regard. But again, give that time. And I think that's some of what is going on. Test question for you. What company in the world has invented the smallest microchip? Because keep in mind, smaller is better when it comes to microchips, because the smaller it is, and you put all these different, if you will, circuits and everything else on a tiny little chip.
Well, I think it's IBM, right? IBM's got 3 nanometer, right?
It's actually 2. They just announced a 2 nanometer. Now, they don't have it in production yet.
Right.
But this is massive, because the leading technology was TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is, a vast amount of the world's most sophisticated chips in the 3 to 5 range. And then you have, I think it's Samsung in Korea, that is making slightly larger, and then you have Intel and the others that are still cranking out tons of 10 and whatever. You need all sizes, but the big prize is the company that can make the smallest, invent the smallest, and then actually you got to produce it. And as you well know, a factory to produce this, because of all the robotics and the sophistication and all the rest of that, is you're talking a $10 to $20 billion investment. Happily, by the way, both TSMC and Samsung are building factories in the United States.
Yes.
So again, that's another good sign. But we have so many issues with which we have to deal. We've got to invest in a lot of these industries. We have to keep the R&D going instead of being flat or gradually declining in real terms. We've got to invest in education. We have to make childhood education more available and more possible at a higher quality. Again, there's so many different issues. Immigration is one on which we need to agree. Frankly, if you come back to the U.S.-China relationship, there's a really important component that no one has talked about, and that is a trade component. I mean, if you're really serious about, again, having a truly coherent and comprehensive whole of government's policy, we would rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership in its new form without us.
Right.
And that is an imperative. But of course, the Fast Track Authority just literally ran out. There's no prospect of it being restored by Congress for the administration. The administration doesn't appear that keen because of presumably domestic political reasons.
Right.
So maybe if they hang on in the midterm, they will be willing to take that on in the second half of the Biden first term presidency. But that's a huge issue. Again, it's all of these different issues. There's never a single factor. There may be one that's more important than others, but all of these are equations with many, many different factors and different coefficients in front of those. It's the same as, in the surge in Iraq. It wasn't just going after the high value targets. It wasn't just reconciliation with the rank and file. It wasn't just clear, hold, and build, living with the people. It was all of that, and many other big ideas, many of which, by the way, are, of course, 180 degrees different from what we were doing during the year leading up to the surge. We've got to get the big ideas right. I think that those big ideas are recognized, the need for them are recognized in a whole host of different areas. And the question is, can our executive, legislative branches get together, get the support of society? Again, it's got to be a whole of society effort as well.
Yeah, no doubt. I do want to take some questions from the audience. So I see Amin Gilani is one of our visiting fellows. He mentioned that he served under you in Iraq when he was active duty in the Air Force. And he's interested in knowing how does the U.S. achieve its or sustain at least its military edge over the next decade?
Well, we have to make some hard decisions there as well.
Yeah.
And by the way, Congress has to support the military services, the Pentagon, in doing what they know they need to do, which is to give up some of the legacy systems that we have, buy fewer of some of them in the future, and able to invest in other systems. To put it in very simplistic terms, to give up again some of the huge, heavily manned, incredibly costly, exquisite,
they're exquisite. I was going to say, they're exquisite.
Big platforms. Whether it's aircraft carrier and all their task force, F-35, the M1 tank. Again, every
overhead imagery,
big platforms, and they're very, very helpful. Don't get me wrong. I loved having 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the Central Command area for the bulk of the time that I was the commander. It's spectacular. That's U.S. soil. But what do we really need? We need a lot more unmanned or remotely piloted air, ground, sea, subsea, space systems that are increasingly semi-autonomous or even at some point autonomous, powered by machine learning, artificial intelligence, the most advanced algorithms. And by the way, that's another area where we have to make some really tough choices. And that is there going to be a person in the loop for the decision to actually pull the trigger? And I would submit that if there is, your machine will be dead because the other side will have a faster algorithm and they're not going to wait on a person. The person in the loop will be in the algorithm and building here are the criteria that must be met, the conditions that must obtain in order to pull the trigger. And by and large, machines can do that faster and frankly, increasingly more accurately, whatever different technologies they're relying upon. And you can see the future coming where we're going to have all kinds of, again, autonomous systems in the bottom of the ocean, in space, available for ground, again, sea and air operations. That's what we have to move to. So how do we maintain our edge? That's how you do it. And by the way, this is hugely challenging because it's actually changing the very conception that services have of themselves.
Yes.
The Army is of a soldier, on the ground, an infantryman or in a tank or with artillery or perhaps long range systems. But you got people in all of these. And by the way, people still going to be crucial, but increasingly it's going to be people with different skill sets. Remember just in the way that unmanned aerial vehicles are remotely piloted, as the Air Force prefers, and more accurately to describe them, were not embraced immediately by those services that had manned aircraft.
Right.
And there was a degree of not resistance, but and Secretary Gates really pushed those systems, and that was game changing. That's what enables us actually to do what we have done. We enabled the Iraqi security forces, we enabled the Syrian Democratic Forces to destroy, actually, certainly to defeat, but even more so, the Islamic State as an army. Now, of course, bad idea to ever fight even a force supported by the U.S. as an army, because if you mass, then you're going to be destroyed.
Right.
But we didn't do the fighting on the front lines the way we had to during the surge in Iraq. We didn't do the reconciliation, the reconstruction, the restoration of basic services, all of these tasks that we actually had to get involved in some cases lead, because if we didn't, the country was going to descend into civil war. Here, because we can put an armada of drones up over those forces, we can fuse intelligence in ways that we never could before, and we can advise and assist remotely, basically, with the commanders and command posts. That is a game-changing capability, and it did change what we were able to do. If we'd had that in the beginning, I remember all the way back when I was a two-star general commanding the Great 101st Airborne Division during the fight to Baghdad.
Right.
And there were 3 Army divisions on the left flank, if you will, the west flank. The Marines were on the right flank on the east. And we were all sort of fighting over the one predator that would occasionally orbit overhead, not even one unblinking eye, not a line, just one predator with a lousy feed, and it wasn't armed, as I recall. I mean, think about how far we have come, both first in Predators and in Reapers, and this ability to keep many, many, many dozens of unblinking eyes over battlefields and to shoot from them when needed, and also the precision air attack capability. So that's how this is advanced in those particular irregular warfare. Again, imagine what that can do in the preparation, really, to deter the adversaries and what is commonly referred to as a great power competition, the return of power competition.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. One of our audience members asked about our conversations revolve in a lot of ways around kinetic threats. Although the China thing is definitely a different story. How concerned are you about growing non-kinetic threats? The audience member asks.
Well, I mean, it's a daily experience. You see what's going on in cyberspace,
right?
And I'm not just even talking about the cyber activities that are being carried out by nation states, by criminals, by extremist groups, and a host of other non-state actors. We're talking about what's going on in social media. You're talking about what's going on, again, in outer space. So again, there are so many areas in which there is actual, call it combat or whatever you want to call it. Right. But there is, cyber warfare is actually ongoing. The Pentagon is bombarded. The networks of the Pentagon are bombarded on a daily basis, as you well know, by, again, this whole array of individuals who wish us ill. And we have to fend them off. And it has gotten more and more and more complex to the point that, of course, you see the Colonial Pipeline shut down, and it disrupts the entire delivery of half of the refined products to the eastern seaboard. It's publicly known we are one of the major investors in Colonial Pipeline, I should know. We saw what happened, of course, with the SolarWinds hack, which was a supply chain, we believe. We saw what happened with the Microsoft Exchange. These are very sophisticated. And in many of the ways that individuals are, again, doing the phishing attacks, the different probes, all the different the ransomware attacks that have proliferated dramatically, and we hear about only a subset of those, a fraction of them. These are vastly more diabolically clever. I'm also on the board of one of the companies we own is the largest pure play cybersecurity services firm. And again, to create the kind of, once again, comprehensive, integrated, managed, and designed cybersecurity architecture is very, very challenging. And very few companies have the capability to do that. They go out and buy this or buy that or buy a couple of different products and a bunch, and they put it together. But again, it has to be comprehensive. It has to be integrated and integratable. It has to be managed. And it has to include all of these different elements of a so-called reference architecture if it is to stand a chance. And then, of course, you have to have a workforce that practices cyber hygiene and systems administrators that are trustworthy. All of the, again, this is a massive challenge for our corporations in the United States today. So you ask about where are the non-kinetic? That's certainly a huge area for that. And again, I think it's going to get more and more challenging. I'm very heartened by the three individuals that President Biden has already in office, or the one, Assistant Director Jane Cook-Easter, still awaiting confirmation, but a brilliant, she was one of our team, West Point Rhodes Scholar, NSA. She came to Baghdad for a week and went home 6 months later, after helping us build the large cloud outside the country at the time, I think, to enable the integration of intelligence of different disparate data forms and so forth.
And the delivery to the warfighter instantaneously of that intelligence. So again, there are others. Again, you have the first cyber czar, Chris Inglis, again, brilliant. And you have the superstar of the individual in the White House as well. All very, very, and Newberg, very, very highly qualified. I do want to change topics a little bit. I will come back to some of the stuff you just talked about, but I've got a great question from Martha Miller. She mentions that you participated in the German Chancellor debate at the Munich Security Conference, and you asked the candidates about Germany's combat readiness. What did you think about the candidates' comments on Germany taking more responsibility for European security and global challenges?
Well, we've had discussions of this many times over the years. So I was in Cold War Europe in NATO. In fact, I had NATO assignments as a 1-star, 3-star, and 4-star general. Usually they were dual-hatted with a U.S. assignment. But I was also the speechwriter for the NATO Supreme Allied Commander in an earlier life, and all the rest of that. And then my first assignments as a lieutenant and captain in Italy, Germany, Belgium, and so forth. And I've tracked over the years, and then also from academia, all of these different, European security defense initiatives and all the rest of it. And the truth is that there has been vastly more discussion of this than there has been resourcing of it. And generally, I often have responded as, I got a bit more senior and it wouldn't seem to be too impertinent, but, and not as bluntly as this perhaps, but, I'm not interested in more headquarters or rearranging the capabilities that you have already. Sometimes that can be useful, particularly if it's done with a rational approach that is trying to really complement the capabilities of each other. But I'm interested in additional capabilities. Are you actually going to spend the 2% of GDP on defense that all of the NATO leaders agreed to at the Wales summit some years ago? And it's publicly known that Germany really isn't even at 1.5%. I think they may be approaching it now. And again, they've made progress. They're doing certain steps. And I should note that the German forces that I was privileged to have as part of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, who conducted, not long after I arrived, the first true post-World War II combat operations, did textbook counterinsurgency, clear, hold, build, gradually transition. Very, very impressive. But the question that I asked for that debate, which we recorded so they could use, had to do with, since then, there was a period where none of the submarines could get, there were no aircraft transport. There were, again, very, very low level of military readiness at a time apparently where they were looking at the potential for some contingency operations or involvement in contingency operations. And so the question is, are you going to get serious about this? And again, I'm all for Europe sharing more of the load, because we should recognize right now, the U.S. doesn't just spend more than all of its 29 NATO allies put together. It spends
Combined.
more than twice as much as all of
Right.
them. And that, again, certainly Europeans should do more. And it has been heartening, actually, to see more European countries break through that 2% of GDP on defense threshold and meet that standard. But still, some really major countries have not achieved that.
Yeah.
And again, who the next chancellor is going to have to address that very issue, both in NATO terms and also in terms of the operational readiness of German forces.
Right.
Which again are very, very capable. I mean, this is a really well-educated, sophisticated, competent force. Yeah. But if the systems they're provided are not sufficiently maintained, then obviously that's a pretty serious drawback.
So Dmitry Alperovich is on our board of advisors and
great man,
co-founder of CrowdStrike, and the chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. He's interested in your views on the Space Force. Good move, bad move.
I thought that was a good move. I applauded that move by the previous administration, and also the way that they did it, where you keep it as part of the Air Force, because the concern whenever you get new structure is that now all of a sudden you don't just get the forces you actually want, the Space Guardians and all the capabilities that they have. You end up having to have a new military academy and, a new basic course, advanced course, staff college, work college. And that is a lot of administrative overhead. It's hugely important. The education of the forces, the professional development is critical.
Right.
But again, that's an awful lot of overhead. So by keeping it under the Air Force, essentially the way you have the Department of Navy that has the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps, and they use some of the same facilities, not all of them. They've actually built out quite a bit on the Marine side, but that's very, very good, I think. And so the way they've gone about, first of all, I thought there was an imperative to do it. It was a good decision. And then the way they have gone about it, I think by and large, now we're still in the early stages. You're just seeing the transition of individuals from the other services to the Space Force and so forth. And time will tell how well we actually do that. But the trend and the decision and all the rest of that, I think, are very good. And by the way, I should also note I'm the honorary co-chairman of Silverado, Dimitri's initiative, which I really applaud. In fact, the other day he had the woman in the White House who he does
Ann Newberger,
and very, very impressively.
Great conversation.
Yep.
Absolutely. So, sir, I think we probably have time for a quick one more question. So let's see. Try to find something. What's the most strategic question you get asked on a recurring basis? Mark Solomon's asks. What's the toughest question you get asked about strategy?
Well, I think it comes back to the evolving U.S.-China relationship.
Right.
We've talked quite a bit about that. I've given the very sort of the biggest of the big ideas about that.
Yeah.
But you've then got to start to operationalize those big ideas. And so how well is the Indo-Pacific theater set for the operations that it could be called upon to conduct? And by the way, if it's ready for those, the perception of a would-be adversary will be that perhaps the capabilities are impressive and there's a will to employ those capabilities just because they have taken all these different steps.
Right.
And having been privileged to be a combatant commander of an area of responsibility, U.S. Central Command, which ran from Egypt to Pakistan and Kazakhstan down to Yemen and the pirate-infested waters off Somalia, we were very proud to have about 90% of the world's problems at that time. We'd have a resurgent great power rivalries just yet. But, we were a theater at war, and I know what kinds of capabilities and, again, organizational architecture you have to do that. I mean, we had a full-up Air Operations Center. We had Joint Special Operations Command headquarters was living in our area of responsibility. We had 2 headquarters actually fighting Iraq and Afghanistan. And then a handful of others for a variety of other responsibilities. But it's how do you configure all of this? So,
Yes.
and I think that still is the strategy, the realm, because it is, ends, ways, and means.
Yeah.
And that's into the operationalization, again, of a particular strategy.
Yeah.
And I find that that's drilling down a couple more levels. I've actually had a very good conversation with the new Indo-PACOM commander very early on when he was here in Washington. We spent an evening together. And that's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
Because it gets beyond that, what I've laid out here, and what I put in a monograph when I was a fellow at Harvard about that coherent, comprehensive approach, whole of governance approach.
Right, with the
now
Belfer
let's
Center.
start getting into those. And again, those are fascinating questions. And for what I have enormous admiration for the members of this administration, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. Obviously, Lloyd Austin was, under me in two different combat tours.
Right.
Our Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Milley, and others. Again, there's a really, really talented team. And some of these are just sheer inspired, Bill Burns, a CI director, the AID director, and some others. These are really, really inspired choices. Now it's bringing it all together, though, because again, coherent, comprehensive, whole of governments. And by and large, so far, I think that is proving to be the case. There is an exception, as I mentioned, when it comes, I think, to the decision on Afghanistan, which again, I fear we will regret to come back to where we started. But by and large, I think a very impressive beginning, noting that, it's not always all bad to start in a crisis, as with the beginning of the surge in Iraq, if the outcome can, at the end of the day, be that violence is down by 85% and so forth. Anyway, well, look, this has really been a privilege. You've guided this like the lawyer and counselor that you have been in the past.
Recovering lawyer.
That's it. So thanks for the invitation. Thanks to all the audience that has stayed with us throughout this, and congratulations on a great initiative.
Thanks. Well, General, listen, thanks for spending this time with us. I promise I get you out at 6 at 6:03, so we'll keep it short. So thanks to you for being here. Thanks to the audience for being here. Folks, check out our website, nationalsecurity.gmu.edu. Check out our awesome podcasts, including Iron Butterfly, which you repost on LinkedIn, Fault Lines, NSI Live. We're on Twitter at Mason NatSec. And of course, General Petraeus, thank you again for being here. Awesome conversation. Thank you for your service. And thanks to everybody here. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thanks, Jamil.